Hello, everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. When last we left the crew of the Nautilus, they were in a tight spot. Quite literally, the ship had become stuck underwater, trapped between the great ice wall thought to surround Antarctica and an iceberg, which in its melting had tipped and trapped the ship in a small expanse of water between the iceberg and the wall. By taking soundings of the ice, Captain Nemo and the crew were able to discern where the thinnest portion was and begin to excavate it, hoping to lower the ship through the space and escape. But in doing so, they knew that they would be running very close to a lack of air, for the Nautilus is designed to surface every 24 hours to refresh its air supply. Even with its ballast tanks filled with extra air, they only had 2 days' worth, and they strained to the very last moments before escape. But escape they did, and the last words we read were, "Pure air came flooding into the whole interior of the Nautilus." During that ordeal, noble Conseil and hearty Ned Land had given up some of their air rations for the Professor, hoping to ensure that he, at least, would survive. And that is where we rejoin the story, with Chapter 41, From Cape Horn to the Amazon. How I got up onto the platform, I cannot say. Perhaps Ned Land had carried me there, but I was breathing, taking in the revivifying sea air. My 2 companions were next to me, getting drunk on oxygen. People who have gone without food for a long time are unfortunate in that they cannot gulp down thoughtlessly the first thing given them. But we did not have to restrain ourselves. We could breathe as much as we wanted. And it was the sea breeze, nothing more than the sea breeze, which brought on our sensual intoxication. "Ah," said Conseil, "how good oxygen is. Monsieur need have no fear of breathing it. There's enough for everybody." As for Ned Land, he did not say a word, but merely opened his jaws wide enough to frighten a shark. And what breaths he took! He drew in air like a furnace, going full blast. Our strength soon came back, and when I looked around I saw we were alone on the platform. None of the crew was in sight, not even Captain Nemo. These strange sailors of the Nautilus seemed satisfied with the air entering the submarine. None of them had come up to taste the pleasure of the sea breeze. The first words I uttered were of thanks and gratitude to my 2 companions. Ned and Conseil had prolonged my life during the final hours of our long ordeal, but no gratitude could sufficiently repay such devotion. "Professor," replied Ned Land, Don't even mention it. What did we do? Nothing. It was just a matter of simple arithmetic. Your life was worth more than ours, and so it had to be preserved. No, Ned, I answered. It isn't worth more. No one is superior to a man as kind and generous as you. Goodness, Professor, said the Canadian in an embarrassed tone of voice. And you, my good Conseil, you must have suffered a lot too.
Not too much, to tell the truth. I was lacking a few mouthfuls of air, but I felt I would scrape through. What's more, when I saw Monsieur fainting, it took away my desire to inhale. It, so to speak, took my breath.
Conseil felt embarrassed at the cliché he was about to utter and did not finish his sentence. My friends, I replied, deeply touched, we are bound to one another forever, and with me you have the right, which I am going to take advantage of, retorted the Canadian.
What?
Exclaimed Conseil. Yes, continued Ned Land, there's a right to take you with me when I leave this infernal Nautilus.
By the way,
said Conseil,
are we heading in the proper direction?
Yes, I replied, since we're heading toward the sun, and here the sun means north. That's all very well, said Ned Land, but we still have to find out whether we're heading for the Pacific or the Atlantic, or in other words, toward inhabited or deserted regions. There was no answer to this, and I was afraid Captain Nemo would take us to that vast ocean fringed by the coasts of Asia and America. He would thus be completing his underwater tour of the world and returning to those waters in which the Nautilus had its greatest freedom. But if we went back to the Pacific, far from any inhabited shores, what would happen to Ned Land's project? We would soon find out. The Nautilus was traveling fast. Before long we had passed the Antarctic Circle and were headed for Cape Horn. We reached the tip of the American continent at 7 p.m. on March the 31st. Then all of our past sufferings were forgotten. The memory of our imprisonment in the ice faded from our minds. We thought only of the future. We no longer saw Captain Nemo either in the lounge or on the platform. But each day the first mate marked our position on the chart, and this permitted me to know the Nautilus's exact direction. And that night, to my great satisfaction, it became evident that we were heading north by way of the Atlantic. I told the good news to Ned and Conseil. Good, replied the Canadian, but where exactly is the Nautilus going? I couldn't say, Ned. Do you suppose the captain would now want to go to the North Pole and return to the Pacific through the famous Northwest Passage? I wouldn't present
it to him in the form of a challenge,
replied Conseil. That's all right, said the Canadian. We would just skip out on him beforehand.
In any case, added Conseil, this Captain Nemo is an extraordinary man, and we won't regret having known him.
Especially after we've left him, retorted Ned Land. The next day, April the 1st, when the Nautilus surfaced Several minutes before noon, we sighted land off to the west. It was Tierra del Fuego, which was given this name by early navigators because of the many columns of smoke they saw rising from native huts. This Tierra del Fuego is a vast agglomeration of islands, stretching out 65 miles in length and 173 miles in width, lying between 53 degrees and 56 degrees south latitude, and 67 degrees and 50 minutes and 77 degrees and 15 minutes west longitude. The coastline seemed rather low, but in the distance rose high mountains. I even thought I could make out Mount Sarmiento, which rises 6,790 feet above sea level. It is a pyramid-shaped block of shale with a very pointed peak, which, depending on whether or not it is surrounded by clouds, announces good or bad weather, as Ned Land told me. So, it's a well-known barometer then, my friend.
Yes, monsieur. A natural weather gauge, which has never deceived me in all the times I've sailed through the Straits of Magellan.
Just then, we could see the peak clearly outlined against the sky. This was an omen of good weather, which turned out to be correct. The Nautilus dove underwater and cruised along no more than a few miles off the coast. Through the open glass panels in the lounge, I saw a kind of sea vine, and also some gigantic sea wrack, specimens of which I had seen in the open water around the South Pole. It had shiny, sticky filaments that measured as much as 1,000 feet in length. They were like cables, bigger around than a man's thumb, and very strong. So strong, in fact, that they were often used to moor ships. Another plant, known as Velp, with leaves 4 feet long, was growing among the coral and carpeting the ocean floor. It served as both a nest and food for myriads of shellfish. Seals and otters came there to gorge themselves, eating a mixture of fish and ocean vegetables, rather as the English do. The Nautilus passed at a high speed over this rich, luxuriant bottom. Toward evening, we approached the Falkland Islands, whose high summits I saw the next day. The sea was not very deep. I therefore assumed, not without reason, that these two islands, surrounded by a great number of smaller islands, had once formed part of Patagonia. The Falkland Islands were probably discovered by the famous John Davis and first called the South Davis Islands. Later, Richard Hawkins named them the Maiden Islands. Then, at the beginning of the 18th century, they were called the Malouines by Breton fishermen, and finally the Falkland Islands by the fishermen, to whom they belong today. It's worth noting that the ownership of the Falkland Islands has been disputed ever since the writing of this book. There was a war in the late 20th century, which is a fascinating study about both British politics and the impact of colonialism, which I would encourage the reader to look into further. In these waters, our nets brought in lovely specimens of seaweed, and especially a certain kind of sea wrack, whose roots were loaded with the best mussels in the world. Geese and ducks came on deck by the dozens, and they soon took their place on the ship's menu. As for fish, I particularly noted a bony species related to the goby. I was able to admire many kinds of jellyfish, and particularly the most beautiful of all, called Chrysador, which is found only near the Falkland Islands. Sometimes their swimming bell would be shaped like a very smooth half-globe, with reddish-brown stripes, and ending in 12 symmetrical tentacles. Sometimes they looked like an upside-down basket from which were falling large, graceful leaves and long red twigs. They swam by moving their 4 leaf-shaped arms and letting their thick mass of tentacles float in the water. I would have liked to preserve several specimens of these delicate zoophytes, but they are like clouds, shadows, or phantoms that melt and evaporate once they are out of their natural element. When the last heights of the Falkland Islands had disappeared beneath the horizon, the Nautilus dove to a depth between 65 and 80 feet and followed the coast of South America. Captain Nemo still did not appear. Until April the 3rd, we did not leave the waters of Patagonia, sometimes cruising underwater, sometimes on the surface. Then the Nautilus passed by the large estuary of the Rio Plata, and on April the 4th we were off to Uruguay, but 50 miles out to sea. We still headed north, following the winding coast of South America. By then we had covered 16,000 leagues since coming on board in the Japan Sea. Toward 11 in the morning, we crossed the Tropic of Capricorn at the 37th meridian and passed off Cape Frio. To Ned Land's great displeasure, Captain Nemo did not seem to like being so near the inhabited coast of Brazil, for we travelled at dizzying speed. No fish or bird, however fast it could travel, was able to follow us, and thus whatever curiosities of nature these waters contained escaped all observation. This speed was maintained for several days, and on the afternoon of April the 9th, we sighted the most easterly point of South America, Cape San Roque. But then the Nautilus once again headed out to sea, searching for the underwater valley which lies between this cape and Sierra Leone on the coast of Africa. This valley splits in two at the latitude of the West Indies and ends to the north in an enormous depression 30,000 feet deep. Between there and the Lesser Antilles there rises a vertical cliff 4 miles high, and on a level with the Cape Verde Islands, another wall no less imposing. And between these two barriers lies the submerged continent of Atlantis. The bottom of this immense valley is dotted with several underwater mountains, which give it a very picturesque aspect. All this information is largely based on manuscript charts contained in the library of the Nautilus, charts evidently drawn by Captain Nemo according to his own personal observations. For 2 days we visited these deep, deserted waters. The Nautilus would dive by means of its side fins, travelling in a long diagonal course that would take it to any depth. But on April the 11th, it suddenly surfaced, and we saw the coastline around the mouth of the Amazon, whose estuary is so vast that one can still find fresh water several leagues out to sea. We had crossed the equator. 20 miles to the west lay Guyana, a French territory in which we would have found easy refuge. But the wind was blowing strong, and a dinghy could not have ventured on the surface of such a raging sea. Ned Land undoubtedly realized this, for he said nothing. As for me, I made no allusion to his plans for escape, for I did not want to push him into some rash venture doomed to failure. I took advantage of this delay by making interesting studies. During the 2 days of April the 11th and 12th, the Nautilus remained on the surface, and its dragnet brought in a marvelous variety of zoophytes, fish, and reptiles. The chains holding the dragnet had caught several kinds of zoophytes. For the most part, they were the lovely Ficalinae, belonging to the family of the actinidians, and among other species, there was the Phylactylus protexta, peculiar to this part of the ocean, whose cylindrical body was adorned with vertical lines and red dots, and which was crowned with a marvelous tuft of tentacles. As for shellfish, they consisted of species I had already observed, such as the Turritellae, periphery shells with evenly crossed lines and reddish-brown spots standing out vividly against a flesh-coloured background. Strange pterocerae, looking like petrified scorpions. Translucent cavallinae, argonauts, cuttlefish, which are so good to eat. And a certain species of squid, which ancient naturalists used to classify among the flying fish, and which is used primarily as bait for catching cod. Among the fish of these waters I had not yet had the opportunity to study. I noted various species. Among cartilaginous fish there was a certain kind of lamprey, about 15 inches long, with a greenish head, violet fins, bluish-grey back, silvery brown belly with bright spots and a band of gold encircling the iris of its eye. These strange animals must have been brought out to sea by the currents of the Amazon, for they are freshwater creatures. There was also a species of ray, with a pointed muzzle, thin tail, and long, notched sword in front. Small sharks, 3 feet long, grey and whitish in colour, whose several rows of teeth bent backwards. Anglers, shaped like isosceles triangles, about 1.5 feet long, reddish in colour, with long, wide pectoral fins that made them look like bats, but whose horn-like appendage near their nostrils has earned them the name of sea unicorns. Finally, several kinds of triggerfish, the Curasavian, whose dotted sides shone with a golden tint, and the Caprisca, light violet in colour and with an iridescent lustre like a pigeon's throat. I will finish this somewhat dry but very accurate list with a mention of the bony fish I observed. There were some Odontognathii, whose bright silver hue and thin pointed body made them look like foot-long sardines, a kind of mackerel with 2 anal fins, black centronotai, which fishermen catch by using torches. They are large fish, 6 feet long, with fatty, white, firm flesh, which tastes like eel when served fresh, and like smoked salmon when dried. Wrasse with scales only around the base of their dorsal and anal fins. Chrysopteri, whose gold and silver bodies glitter as if encrusted with rubies and topazes. Gilt heads, which are very tasty, and whose phosphorescence makes them so easy to see in the water. Cyainae, with golden tails. Acanthoterans, Anaptps from Suriname, etc. But this etc. will not prevent me from citing yet one more fish, which Conseil will remember for a long time to come, and not without reason. One of our nets had brought in a kind of very flat ray, weighing about 45 pounds, which, without its tail, would have formed a perfectly round disc. Its smooth skin, ending in a double-lobed fin, was white on top and reddish underneath, with big dark blue spots encircled in black. Once on the platform, it writhed around, trying to turn back over on its stomach, and in its struggle, it got so near the edge that one last flip and it would have fallen back into the sea. But Conseil, who hated to lose a fish like this, jumped on it and grabbed it with both hands before I could stop him. He was instantly thrown back. He lay on the platform with his legs in the air and his body half paralyzed, shouting, "Help, monsieur! Help!" Ned Land and I picked him up, massaged him, and when he had finally come back to his senses, this eternal classifier murmured in halting tones,
"A class of cartilaginous fish, order of chondropterygons with fixed gills, suborder of cetaceans, family of the rays, genus of electric ray."
"Yes, my friend, an electric ray that almost knocked you out."
"Oh, yes, monsieur, believe me,"
retorted Conseil.
"but I'll get my revenge on this animal."
"How?"
"By eating it."
And so he did, that very night, but purely out of a feeling of retaliation, for it was apparently quite leathery. Poor Conseil had attacked an electric ray of the most dangerous kind, the cumana. This strange animal, living in a medium like water which conducts electricity, can kill fish several yards away. So great is the power of his electrical organ, whose two principal surfaces measure no less than 27 square feet. On the next day, April the 12th, the Nautilus approached the mouth of the Moroni River on the coast of Dutch Guiana. There we saw sea cows living in family groups. These manatees, like the dugong and Stella's sea cow, belong to the order of Sirenia. They are peaceful and inoffensive animals, which grow as long as 20 or 25 feet and weigh up to 9,000 pounds. I told Ned Land and Conseil that far-sighted nature had assigned these animals an important role. It is they and seals who have been destined to graze on underwater prairies, and thus destroy those agglomerations of plants which obstruct the mouth of tropical rivers. And do you know, I added, what has happened since man has almost completely destroyed these useful creatures? Rotting plants have fouled the air, and it is this foul air that has produced the yellow fever laying waste to these remarkable lands. Poisonous vegetation has increased beneath these warm seas, and this disease has spread unchecked from the mouth of the Rio Plata to Florida. And if one is to believe Toussaint, this scourge is nothing to that which will strike our descendants when the seas become empty of whales and seals. Then, filled with octopus, jellyfish, and squid, they will become vast centers of infection, since their waters will no longer possess those vast stomachs which God has delegated to scour the surface of the seas. Nevertheless, the crew of the Nautilus caught 6 of these sea cows. It was a question of laying in a stock of excellent meat, superior to beef or veal, but the hunting was not interesting. The sea cows let themselves be caught without putting up any defense. Several thousand pounds of meat was stored on board to be dried and preserved. That day, the Nautilus's stock was further increased through a very strange manner of fishing. The dragnet had brought up a certain amount of fish whose heads end in an oval plaque with fleshy edges. They were echines of the third family of Sabrachian malacopterygons. This flat disc on their head is composed of mobile, transversal, cartilaginous layers, between which the animal can create a vacuum, thus permitting him to fasten on to things like a leech. The remora, which I have observed in the Mediterranean, belongs to this species. But the one we saw here was Echines ostracara, found only in these waters. Our sailors took them out of the nets and deposited them in tubs full of water. Once this was done, the Nautilus went in nearer the coast. There, a certain number of sea turtles were sleeping on the surface. It would have been difficult to catch these precious reptiles, for the least sound awakens them, and their solid shell protects them from harpoons. But the Echines was to help capture them with extraordinary ease and assurance. This animal, in fact, is a living fishhook, and could be of great use to the ordinary fisherman. To the tail of these fish, the sailors attached a ring large enough not to cramp their movements, and to this ring a long line which was tied on board at its other end. The Echines were then thrown into the sea, and immediately they started to work attaching themselves to the turtle's shells. They held on with such determination that they would have been torn apart rather than let go. They were then hauled on board, along with the turtles to whom they were attached. In this way we caught several cuckwans, with about 3 feet long, and weighing about 450 pounds apiece. Their shells were covered with very valuable horny plaques, which were a transparent brown colour, with white and yellow spots. Moreover, their flesh was excellent to eat. This fishing ended our sojourn in the waters off the Amazon basin, and as night came on the Nautilus once more, we headed for the open sea. Chapter 42. Squid. For several days, the Nautilus remained far from any shore. It obviously did not want to enter the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean, even though it would not have found itself in uncomfortably shallow water, since the average depth of these seas is 6,000 feet. But probably a region so full of islands and so constantly crossed by steamers was not to Captain Nemo's liking. On April the 16th, we sighted Martinique and Guadeloupe from about 30 miles offshore. For a moment, I could make out their highest peaks. The Canadian, who had counted on being able to escape in the Caribbean, either by reaching land or by hailing one of the many ships that ply between the various islands, was very disappointed. It would have been quite easy to get away there, if Ned Land had been able to get the dinghy without the captain's knowledge, but on the open ocean there was no longer any question of trying. Ned, Conseil, and I had a long conversation on the subject. We had now been prisoners aboard the Nautilus for 6 months. We had covered 17,000 leagues, and as Ned Land put it, there was no reason to think it would ever end. He therefore made an unexpected proposal. It was to ask the captain, in no uncertain terms, whether or not he intended to keep us on board indefinitely. This did not strike me as a good idea, but rather one doomed to failure. I felt that we should expect nothing from the commander of the Nautilus, and rely only on ourselves. Moreover, for some time now this man had become sombre, more withdrawn, and less sociable. He seemed to avoid me. I only saw him once in a great while. He had formerly enjoyed explaining to me the wonders of undersea life, but now he left me alone in my studies, and no longer came to the lounge. What sort of a change had come over him? What had brought it on? I had done nothing for which he could blame me. Had our presence on board perhaps begun to disturb him? Yet I had no reason to hope he would set us free. I therefore asked Ned Land to let me think it over before doing anything. If this plan did not succeed, it could revive his suspicions, make our situation difficult, and harm the Canadian's prospects. I must add that I could not give our physical condition as a reason, for except for the trying experience under the great ice barrier, we had never been in better health, neither Ned, Conseil, nor I. The healthy food, invigorating air, regular hours, and uniform temperature kept illness at bay. Moreover, for a man like Captain Nemo, who did not miss life on land, for whom this was his home, and who was free to go where he wanted, I could understand such an existence. But we had not broken with humanity. And as for me, I had done much interesting new research, and I did not want to have it buried with me. I now would be able to write a definitive book on the sea, and I wanted this work to see the light of day, sooner or later. And even here, in West Indian waters, at a depth of 35 feet, with the panels open, how many interesting things I was able to observe and set down in my daily notes. Among other zoophytes, there were Portuguese men-of-war, known as pelagic physalia, fat and oblong in shape, with a mother-of-pearl tint, holding up their membrane to the wind and letting their blue thread-like tentacles float on the surface. To the eye, they seemed like beautiful jellyfish, but to the touch, they were like poisonous nettles. Among the articulata, I saw some sea worms, about 5 feet long, armed with a pink horn and equipped with 1,700 organs of locomotion, winding and twisting through the water, and gleaming with all the colors of the rainbow. Among various fish, I saw enormous devilfish, a kind of ray 6 feet long and weighing 600 pounds, with triangular pectoral fins, a slight hump in the middle of its back, and eyes placed on the extreme front sides of its head. They were floating in the water like wrecked ships, and sometimes they covered our window like a thick shutter. There were also triggerfish, which nature has colored only black and white. A kind of goby with a long, plump body, yellow fins and protruding lower jaw. Some mackerel, 5 feet long, with short, sharp teeth, their bodies covered with small scales. In addition, we saw clouds of red mullets, with shining fins and golden stripes running from their head to their tail. These masterpieces of jewelry were once upon a time considered sacred to Diana, and they were particularly sought after by rich Romans. There was a proverb about them which said, "He who catches them can never eat them." Lastly, we saw golden pomacanthi, dressed in velvet and silk, and decorated with emerald green bands, passing before our eyes like lords and ladies from a Veronese painting. Spurred gilt heads, which dashed off with one stroke of their powerful underfin. clupanodons, 15 inches long, wrapped in a phosphorescent gleam. Common mullets churning the water with their big, plump tails. Red corrigoni, which seem to be mowing the ocean with their sharp pectoral fin. And silver moonfish, worthy of their name, rising on the horizon of the sea like so many pale moons. How many other marvelous new specimens of fish I could still have observed if the Nautilus had not, little by little, dived down to deep water. Its side fins brought it to depths ranging from 6,500 to 11,000 feet. There, the animal kingdom was represented only by sea lilies, starfish, charming pentacrini with a straight stalk bearing a little chalice, top shells, and a type of coastal mollusk called keyhole limpets. On April 20th, we came back up to a depth of 5,000 feet. The nearest land was the Bahamas, spread out like so many paving stones on the surface of the water. There we saw underwater cliffs formed by worn blocks of stone arranged like bricks, between which there were dark holes whose depths the rays of our searchlight could not reach. These rocks were carpeted with huge plants, giant sea tangles and sea wracks, forming a bower of hydrophytes worthy of a world of titans. As we talked about these colossal plants, Ned, Conseil, and I were naturally led into a discussion about the gigantic animals of the ocean. For one was obviously intended as nourishment for the other. Nevertheless, as I looked through the window of the now almost immobile Nautilus, I could make out nothing among these long filaments but the principal articulata of the division of Branchipodi, sea spiders, with their long legs, purple-blue crabs, and Cleos, peculiar to the West Indian waters. It was about 11 o'clock when Ned Land drew my attention to a formidable wriggling movement among the long seaweed. "Those are the kind of caves that squid live in," I said, "and I wouldn't be surprised to see several of these monsters."
"What?"
exclaimed Conseil.
"Squid? Mere squid from the class of cephalopods?"
"No," I said. "Giant squid." But Ned must have made some mistake, for I don't see anything.
"Ah, that's too bad,"
said Conseil.
"I'd like to come face to face with one of these giant squid I've heard so much about, and which can drag ships down to the bottom. They're called kraken, I believe."
"You'll never get me to believe such animals exist," said Ned Land.
"Why not?"
replied Conseil.
"We believed in Monsieur's narwhal."
"And we were wrong, Conseil."
"Yes, but others still believe in it."
"Maybe they do, Conseil. But as for me, I've decided not to admit these monsters really exist until I've dissected one with my own hands."
"Doesn't Monsieur believe in giant squid either?"
Conseil asked me.
"Who in the name of heaven has ever believed in them?"
cried the Canadian. "Lots of people, Ned, my friend."
Maybe scientists, but not fishermen."
"No, Ned, both fishermen and scientists."
"I myself can remember,"
said Conseil, with the most serious tone of voice in the world,
"having seen a large boat dragged down by the arms of a squid."
"You've seen that?"
asked the Canadian.
"Yes, Ned."
"With your own eyes?"
"With my own eyes."
"Where? If you don't mind telling me."
At Saint Malo.
replied Conseil imperturbably. In the harbour? Asked Ned Land sarcastically.
No, in a church.
In a church? Cried the Canadian.
Yes, Ned. It was a painting of a squid.
That's a good one, exclaimed Ned Land as he burst out laughing. Ah, monsieur, Conseil's trying to pull a fast one on me. He's right, I said. I've heard about that painting. But the subject it represents is taken from a legend, and you know how trustworthy legends are when it comes to natural history. Moreover, when it's a question of monsters, people's imaginations ask nothing better than to be given free rein. Not only has it been claimed that squid and octopus could drag down ships, but a certain Oleus Magnus talks of a mile-long cephalopod, which looked more like an island than an animal. They also tell of the Bishop of Midros, who one day set up his altar on a huge rock to say Mass. Once Mass was over, the rock moved off and went back out to sea. The rock was an octopus. Oh, is that all? Asked the Canadian.
No, I replied. Another bishop, Pontoppidan of Bergen, talks of an octopus on which a regiment of cavalry could maneuver.
In the old days, bishops must have been good storytellers, said Ned Land.
And lastly, naturalists of ancient times mention monsters whose mouths were the size of gulfs and who were too big to pass through the Straits of Gibraltar.
That's a good one, all right, exclaimed the Canadian.
But how much truth is there in all these stories? Asked Conseil.
None, my friends,
or at least none which does not pass the bounds of probability and enter the realm of fable or legend. Nevertheless, there must have been something which stimulated the imagination of these storytellers. It can't be denied that there exist species of octopus and squid which grow to great size, although still smaller than whales. Aristotle saw a squid 5 cubits long, or in other words 10 feet and 2 inches. The museums of Trieste and Montpellier have skeletons of octopuses 6.5 feet long. Moreover, naturalists have calculated that one of these creatures, with a body 6 feet long, would have tentacles 27 feet long, which would make it a pretty formidable monster.
Do people fish for them nowadays? Asked the Canadian.
No, but sailors see them all the time. One of my friends, Captain Paul Bos from Le Havre, has often told me about how he met one of these enormous monsters in the Indian Ocean. But the most astonishing event, and one which dispels all doubts concerning the existence of such gigantic animals, took place several years ago, in 1861.
What happened? Asked Ned Land.
Well, in that year, to the northwest of Tenerife, at very nearly the same latitude we're in now, the crew of the dispatch vessel Alecton noticed a huge squid swimming near the ship. Commander Bouger brought the ship alongside, had the creature harpooned and shot, but without much success, for the bullets and harpoons went through its soft flesh as if it were loose jelly. After several unsuccessful attempts, the crew managed to pass a slip knot around the creature's body. The loop slid back to the caudal fins, and there it stopped. They then tried hauling the monster on board, but it weighed so much that its tail merely broke off, and the squid itself, separated from this part of its body, disappeared beneath the surface.
Finally, we have some facts, said Ned Land.
Indisputable facts, my good Ned. As a result of what had happened, people suggested naming this creature Bouger's squid.
How long was it? Asked the Canadian.
Wasn't it about 20 feet long?
Said Conseil, standing at the window and once more examining the rugged cliffs. Precisely, I answered.
And, wasn't its head,
Conseil went on,
crowned with 8 tentacles which thrashed about in the water like a nest of snakes?
Absolutely.
And, didn't it have huge popping eyes?
Yes, Conseil.
And, wasn't its mouth like a parakeet's beak, but enormous?
That's right.
Well then, if Monsieur doesn't mind me saying so,
Conseil replied calmly,
this is either Boucher's squid or one of its first cousins.
I looked at Conseil. Ned Land rushed to the window. Oh, what a horrible creature! He cried. I then looked around, and I could not repress a gesture of repulsion. Before my eyes wriggled a terrible monster, worthy of all the legends about such creatures. It was a giant squid, about 25 feet long. It was headed toward the Nautilus, swimming backward very fast. Its huge, immobile eyes were of a blue-green color. The 8 arms, or rather legs, coming out of its head, it is this which has earned it the name of cephalopod, which means head foot, were twice as long as its body, and were twisting about like the hair of a Greek fury. We could clearly make out the 250 suckers lining the inside of its tentacles, some of which fastened onto the glass panel of the lounge. This monster's mouth, a horny beak like that of a parakeet, opened and closed vertically. Its tongue, also made out of a horn-like substance and armed with several rows of sharp teeth, would come out and shake what seemed like veritable cutlery. What a whim of nature! A bird's beak in a mollusk. Its elongated body, with a slight swelling in the middle, formed a fleshy mass which must have weighed between 40 and 50,000 pounds. Its colour, which could change very fast depending upon the animal's mood, would vary from a ghastly grey to a reddish brown. What was irritating this creature? Undoubtedly it was the presence of the Nautilus, which was more formidable than it, and on which its arms and suckers could get no hold. Yet what monsters are such squid? What vitality the Creator has given them, and what vigour of movement! And to think they possess 3 hearts. We had encountered this mollusk quite by chance, and I did not want to lose the opportunity of studying it carefully. I overcame my horror at the sight of it, and taking up a pencil, started to draw it.
This is perhaps the same one they almost caught on the Alecton,
said Conseil. No, replied the Canadian, because this one's whole, and the other one had lost his tail. That doesn't make a difference, I said. The arms and tails of these creatures can reform by a special process, and I'm sure that in several years Boucher's squid has had time to grow another tail. Besides, said Ned, if it isn't this one, maybe it's one of those. And in fact, other squid had appeared outside the starboard window. I counted 7. They were swimming in a procession around the Nautilus, and I could hear the noise of their beaks grinding on the steel hull. Our wishes were more than satisfied. I continued my work. These monsters kept up with us so easily that they seemed immobile, and I could easily have traced a reduced outline of one on the window. Besides, we were not travelling very fast. Suddenly, the Nautilus stopped, There was a blow which made it quiver throughout its length. "Have we struck ground?" I asked. "If we did, we're already free," replied the Canadian. "For we're moving." But even though the Nautilus was floating, it wasn't moving. The blades of its propeller were not revolving in the water. After a minute or so, Captain Nemo entered the lounge, followed by the first mate. I had not seen him for some time. He seemed gloomy. Without saying a word to us, perhaps without even seeing us, he went over to the glass panel, looked at the squid, and said several words to his first mate, who then left the room. Soon the panels closed, and the ceiling lights came on. I went over to the captain. "A curious collection of squid," I said, in the off-hand tone of voice of someone standing before the window of an aquarium. "Indeed it is, monsieur," he replied, "and we're going to fight them, hand in hand." I looked at the captain. I thought I had not heard him right. "Hand to hand?" I repeated. "Yes, monsieur. The propeller has been stopped. I think one of these squid has got his horned beak caught up in the propeller, and now we can't move." "What do you intend to do?" "Surface the ship and wipe out all this vermin." "That will be difficult." "Yes, it will. Our electric bullets have no effect against these animals, for their soft flesh doesn't offer enough resistance to make them explode. But we'll attack them with axes." "And with a harpoon, monsieur," said the Canadian, "if you'll permit me to help you." "I accept, Mr. Land." "We'll go with you," I said, and we followed Captain Nemo to the central companionway. There, 10 or 12 men armed with boarding axes were ready for the attack. Conseil and I each took an axe, and Ned Land a harpoon. By then, the Nautilus had surfaced. One of the sailors at the top of the companionway unscrewed the bolts holding down the hatch, but hardly had they been unscrewed when the hatch flew up with great violence, obviously pulled up by the suckers on a squid's arm. One of these long arms immediately slid like a snake into the opening, and 20 others were waving about above. With one blow of his axe, Captain Nemo cut this formidable tentacle, and it slid, writhing down the companionway. Just as we were pressing one another to get out on the platform, 2 other arms came slashing down through the air, grabbed the sailor in front of Captain Nemo, and pulled him out with irresistible force. Captain Nemo let out a cry and rushed up to the platform. We clambered out after him. What a scene! That poor man was being clutched by the tentacles with their suckers and waved about in the air. He was half dead and choking, but he managed to shout, "Help! Help!" I was astounded to hear these words uttered in French. So, I had a compatriot on board, perhaps several. All my life I shall hear this heart-rending cry. The poor man was done for. Who could save him from such a powerful grip? Nevertheless, Captain Nemo hurled himself at the squid, and with one blow of his axe cut off yet another arm. The first mate struggled furiously with other monsters which were climbing up the sides of the Nautilus. The crew were flailing away with their axes. Ned, Conseil, and I also dug our weapons into their soft bodies. A violent odor of musk filled the air. It was horrible. For a moment, I thought the poor man entangled in the squid would be saved from its powerful suckers. 7 of its 8 arms had been cut, Only one, brandishing the victim like a feather, still writhed about in the air. But just as Captain Nemo and the first mate rushed at it, the animal let out a jet of black ink. We were blinded by it. When the cloud of spray had cleared away, the squid had disappeared, and with it my unfortunate compatriot. With what a fury we then attacked these monsters. We were beyond ourselves. 10 or 12 squid had invaded the platform and sides of the Nautilus. We were struggling pell-mell in the midst of snake-like pieces of tentacles, jumping about on the platform among torrents of blood and black ink. It seemed as if these slimy arms grew back instantly, like a hydra's heads. Each time Ned Land wielded his harpoon, it would plunge into a squid's sea-green eyes. But suddenly, my brave companion was knocked over by the tentacles of a monster he could not avoid. Oh, how close my heart came to breaking from emotion and horror. The squid's huge mouth had opened over Ned Land. The poor man was about to be cut in two. I rushed over to help him, but Captain Nemo had gotten there first. He buried his axe between the two enormous jaws, and Ned Land, miraculously saved, got up and plunged his harpoon deep into the creature's triple heart. "I owed you this," said Captain Nemo. Ned bowed his head without answering. The struggle had lasted 15 minutes. The monsters, defeated, mutilated, or killed, finally left us and disappeared beneath the surface. Captain Nemo, covered with blood and standing immobile next to the searchlight, looked at the sea, which had swallowed up one of his companions, and tears ran down his cheeks. All right, my friends, it is there that I will leave you today, after such an intense confrontation. Long through the book we have wondered at the mystery of who the crew of the Nautilus is, for they speak in their own strange language and have no obvious affiliations to any one nation. With that in mind, the cries of the man in the grips of the squid call out to me as well as they did to the professor. There is something about the intensity of those last moments and the loss of the self-control required to keep that straight face and use the secret tongue, the tongue not of the land or of the past, but of the new world of the Nautilus. The loss of that is primal and quite moving. I have always wondered, as we've been reading this book together, about how reliable Jules Verne is in terms of his descriptions of underwater life. And I think that many times he is overstating things for their dramatic effect. Dugongs 25 feet long would be an impressive sight. I don't think they quite get to be that big. But when he talks about the skeletons of octopods in various museums, I know for a fact that that is incorrect. These creatures have no spines, no bones, save for their beaks, and are able to manipulate their tentacles in whatever way they choose. Sometimes the tentacles are even known to act independently. A fascinating set of creatures, some of my favorite animals. But I digress, and if we get on the topic of talking about cephalopods, I could go on for far too long. So I will leave you now.
But until next we meet, I wish you all the best, and goodbye.